Because of the technological advances found during World War I, America finds itself in a transition period where it's becoming more modern. Thus, we have the Roaring Twenties. We are in the second industrial revolution. What's going on here is that the U.S. has its highest standard of living in comparison to the rest of the world. In the 1920s, we are seeing electricity replace steam power. We're seeing oil, petroleum replace coal. Modern assembly is being introduced, and not in just cars, in everything from washing machines to toaster ovens, whatever. We're seeing this assembly getting done much more rapidly, much more quickly, efficiently, and at a lower cost. The increase of the automobile industry, automakers had to find a way to sell more and more cars. They're doing this through different model changes, advertising campaigns, marketing. What's newer, what's better, that's what they were promoting, trying to get more and more sales for their vehicles. Now, because of that increase in the automobile industry, other businesses were growing also. So places along highways, places to camp out via a vehicle, motels, diners in the middle of nowhere. These were businesses that were growing and growing because of this urban sprawl. We see more highways getting built, more paved highways, even more important, because you got to think about the cars during this time frame. They have those skinny little wheels, easy to get stuck. So definitely paved roads were important in order to increase transportation. About 4 million Americans owed their jobs solely to the auto industry, and this isn't all the other businesses that came along with it. Other technologies that were growing were things like radio, motion pictures. We see professional managers replacing entrepreneurs, because you have to think about it, these businesses were just growing and growing and growing, and through vertical and horizontal integration, these businesses were massive. So individual entrepreneurs, in order for them to break in to corporate America, was nearly impossible, because these big companies, they could produce a product much more efficiently, much cheaper. Thus, the price of that product is going to be a whole lot less. So we see corporations really becoming the dominant business form. And these corporations, of course, they too, just like the automotive industry, they're marketing, they're creating these national brands. The little mom and pop stores or pop businesses are beginning to disappear because of these national brands. Some negatives of this really is the lack of choice. You have to buy this national brand because it's cheaper. It's putting those other people out of business. The Roaring Twenties wasn't all about the roar itself. We do see some economic weaknesses, railroads being poorly managed. When things aren't on time as far as the railroad's concerned, that's not good. People are losing money when things like that happen. Like I said before, coal is being displaced by petroleum. Farmers, like we talked about in the starter, very, very bad situation for them. During World War II, they met the need for Europeans to have their agricultural goods. World War I's over now, and because it's over, price just bottoms out. It bottoms out because nobody's buying the goods. There's too much production. These farmers, they took out loans for tractors, more land, and now they're not able to pay these loans, so they're losing their tractors, they're losing their farms. So the agricultural portion of the economy does not look good at this point. And remember, historically speaking, agriculture is the backbone of American economy at this point. We do see a growing disparity between income. So there is a wage gap, an income gap between middle class and upper class. The middle class themselves, they do have some disposable income, and they're taking this income and they're starting to invest into companies. They have no idea if these companies are going to do well. They see wealthy people investing in the stock market, and they try to jump on that bandwagon. So kind of a scary situation, being that, they don't really have an education on the stock market and how it reacts. Kind of similar today when we look at E-Trade. So, people who take part in the modern day e-trade, and they don't really pay attention to the volatility of stocks, they could really, lose a lot of their own wealth. Right down here, I'm showing a graph. This is more modern day. If you look right here, 1977 to 2014, you can see the cyclical pattern of the different recessions that we have here in the United States. So every 8 to 14-ish years, somewhere around there, we typically have a recession. Our last recession, it ended in 2010. And like I said, anywhere from 8 to 14 years, we typically have a recession. So not that I'm trying to make any predictions here, but at the same time, it's something to be mindful of. So because a lot of these farmers are relying upon mechanization of industrialized farming, we don't need as many people working in rural America. A lot of these rural Americans, they move to the cities. This is where the jobs are at. There's different factories, different mills that they can work at. So we do see a huge increase in the city. So instead of growing horizontally, these buildings are growing vertically, i.e. skyscrapers, in order to house all these people. Communities of home, church, and school, we don't see them growing as fast as the cities themselves. So there were churches, there were schools in the cities, but as this huge influx of population comes into the cities, these institutions cannot keep up. So kids not going to school, people aren't going to church, so you can just kind of imagine what people are getting into instead. So to displace that somewhat, we see new ideas, new creativity, new perspectives upon how our culture should be. This is kind of an interesting note right here, a little side note. There was a prize to who can build not just the tallest, but the most beautiful skyscraper. And Chicago, the Tribune Tower, did win this prize. So during 1920, we see the 19th Amendment getting passed. So women's crusade for equal rights is achieved. Women are now able to vote. However, we still need to realize that the majority of American women, they still remain within that domestic sphere. I know a lot of times media, different literature about the 20s talks about flappers and people dancing, having a great time, the jazz era. Yet at the same time, you have to realize that still the majority of women, they remained in traditional roles. Okay? We do see a discovery of adolescence where teenage children no longer needed to work, okay, because of mechanization, because of not being on the farm where you need your children to work all the time. Teenagers, younger children, they're not needed to be in that work environment, so they're looking for things to do. So what do? So this is when many of our national pastimes come to the forefront. Things like different sports, golf, baseball, football. We also see a crime wave. This is obviously because of Prohibition, something we worked on in class, or we will work on in class. Decades of celebrities. We see the first women to swim across the English Channel, so from England to France. We see a first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis. All right, so not everybody was completely enthralled with the culture that was seen during the 20s. So certain Americans, they did leave the United States and went ahead and wrote about some of the ills of the 20s. So if we look at Eliot, some Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, some of these authors really talked and criticized the flaws and the contradictions of the 1920s. Yeah, sure, a lot of people were doing really, really well, yet at the same time there was a lot of racial tension, there was a lot of poor distribution of wealth that these authors were getting into. During the Harlem Renaissance, some big names like Langston Hughes really comes to the forefront. Well-known writer. Now, speaking of some of the contradictions, we do see a rise in crime, immorality, bigotry, issues with repression. So, it wasn't all roaring here. We do see some fear of radicalism. This is the first Red Scare. Please make sure you do note that this is the first Red Scare. There will be a second also a little bit later on when we talk about the Cold War. So the first Red Scare, we are rounding up different people that we think are communist sympathizers. Men like Sacco and Vanzetti, they get electrocuted. They're accused of robbery and murder. We weren't entirely sure. They were convicted on some pretty shaky evidence, and it just was really rushed through the court system. Something that should not have happened. Of course, with the passage of the 18th Amendment, we have Prohibition. The Volstead Act gets passed in 1920, prohibits the production, sale, or transport of alcoholic beverages. But if you notice, consumption is not illegal. However, the production, sale, and transport is. So consumption of alcohol is definitely reduced. We do see some improvements in industry because people aren't showing up to work hungover or drunk. So we do see some positives during this time. But because you have just made something illegal, people are going to create a lucrative smuggling business out of it. So this became a really big business for a lot of areas. So earlier I talked about bigotry. Some of this bigotry was targeting Catholics, Jews, African Americans, women. Specifically, the Ku Klux Klan was doing a lot of this. We see their membership hitting up to 5 million. And a lot of these members of the KKK, it's not just in the South anymore. So it's in the North, it's in the Mideast, it's in the Midwest. We see the Ku Klux Klan, spreading to different areas within the United States. So one of the reasons why we see an expanse of the KKK is they're trying to defend the traditional rural values of the United States. Something that was, kind of taking the back seat during the 20s because a lot of people, they're going to the cities and you don't have those rural values found within the cities. Now, because of some influx of violence caused by the KKK, also combined with some internal corruption of the Ku Klux Klan, we do see the Klan itself being reduced by the 1930s. This bigotry is also found at the federal level. We see an immigration restriction in 1924 with the National Origins Act. It basically states that we're not going to accept any more immigrants over 150,000 quota, and it also favored specifically Northern Europeans. So not Eastern Europeans, not Southern Europeans, but specifically Northern Europeans. So we're talking Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, those type of areas. Okay, Mexican immigration was exempted from this quota because of areas like California, for example, that needed a population to work in the agricultural sectors in those areas. Progressive ideas that were really getting going during the 20s. There is also a kickback from that as well. So we have a Tennessee teacher wanting to teach evolution because he's teaching evolution and it is technically against state law to do so. He's brought up on charges by Tennessee. So it's Tennessee versus John Scopes.